Why should we even be talking about prayer and healing? The most practical reason is that, at least some of the time, prayer works. The evidence is simply overwhelming that prayer can change physical processes in a variety of organisms, from bacteria to humans. The word prayer comes from the Latin precarious, obtained by begging, and precari, which means to ask earnestly. This suggests two of the commonest forms of prayer: petition, in which we ask something for ourselves, and intercession, in which we ask something for someone else. Prayer may be individual or communal, private or public. It may be offered in words, sighs, in gestures, or silence. Prayer may even emerge in dreams, completely bypassing our waking awareness. Prayer says something immensely important about who we are and what our destiny may be. Since prayer is initiated by mental action, this implies that there is some aspect of our psyche that is infinite in space and time. In the West, this infinite aspect of the psyche is referred to as the soul. Empirical evidence for prayer's power, then, is indirect evidence of the soul. It is a fact that patients sometimes improve dramatically following prayer. And in my judgment, when something affects human bodies, medicine should find out more about it by asking certain questions, such as, was the patient's improvement a result of the prayer, or was it a mere coincidence? If prayer actually caused the improvement, how did it do so? How reliable is prayer? If prayer does work, is it potent enough to be used alone, or should it be combined with orthodox therapies such as drugs or surgery? Are some prayer strategies better than others? Can prayer ability be acquired, or is it innate? What conditions facilitate the effects of prayer? Is the effect of prayer always positive, or can it hurt as well as help? These are the questions a scientist would be interested in asking, and these are the questions we shall pursue on this tape. One of the most puzzling illnesses in history took place some 2,500 years ago when the Buddha, the awakened one, died from food poisoning, having been fed tainted meat. Not a very exalted way for a Buddha to go. Later I found that many great spiritual leaders have suffered ignominious ends. Some examples include Saint Bernadette, who in 1858 saw the vision of the Virgin at Lourdes, where thousands of healings are claimed to have occurred. Bernadette didn't receive such a healing when she needed one. Cause of death, variously called bone cancer or disseminated tuberculosis, at age 35. Jiddu Krishnamurti, the famous spiritual teacher. Cause of death, cancer of the pancreas. Suzuki Roshi, who brought Zen Buddhism from Japan to the United States. Cause of death, cancer of the liver. Sri Ramana Maharshi, the most beloved saint of modern India. Cause of death, cancer of the stomach. History is clear. The health records of many of the most majestic, God-realized saints and mystics are far from ideal. The so-called explanations offered for these events are numerous. Some say the saint or the mystic wasn't really as spiritual as he or she seemed, or that he or she was indeed enlightened, but was living out his or her karma, paying back for shortcomings of previous lives. Others maintain the great teacher inadvertently took on the illness of his or her devotees, or intentionally took on the illness as a final test. These may or may not be valid reasons. Our task here is not to figure out how in every case the God-realized person got sick and died, but simply to acknowledge that they did so. Above all, these accounts should make us question the prevalent assumption that A, being holy is a guarantee of good health, and that B, bad health and illness always imply spiritual shortcomings. When Jesus encountered a man who was blind from birth, his disciples asked, "Master, who did sin, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?" This question comes in a variety of New Age contexts today. Who's at fault? Why did I choose this illness? Jesus' answer is illuminating and should be emblazoned in every New Age book dealing with consciousness and healing. He said, "Neither hath this man sinned nor his parents, but that the works of God should be made manifest in him." John chapter 9, verses 1 through 3. Jesus implies there may be a higher purpose to the illness, known only to the divine. On balance, this case warns against equating spiritual and physical health, and cautions us against attributing shallow, superficial meaning to illness. Sickly saints and mystics are only one side of the coin. They're mirrored by individuals who have no obvious spiritual inclinations whatever, but who never get sick. Almost everyone knows or has heard of such a person. They break all the rules of good health, they smoke and drink with abandon, and they live to be 100. Sickly saints and healthy sinners show us that there is no one-to-one relationship between one's level of spiritual attainment and the degree of one's physical health. It's obvious that one can attain immense spiritual heights and still get very sick. When we fail to perfectly embody the Absolute, we do not say that God sinned or fell short. Why then do we insist that a breakdown at the level of the body always implies that we erred? When animals or plants get sick, we do not judge or blame them. In nature, the occurrence of disease is considered a part of the natural order. We are a part of nature no less than other creatures. The kindness, forgiveness, and gentleness that we extend to them when they develop disease could well be extended to ourselves. Mystery irritates. It demands solutions. When faced with mystery, we often engage in desperate attempts to solve it. If we're ever to understand the role of prayer in healing, we'll have to grow more tolerant of ambiguity and mystery. We shall have to be willing to stand in the unknown. During illness, we almost always want to enter therapy where there is already a well-trodden path. We want a formula that tells us what to do. The impulse to do when sick is understandable, to take the antibiotic with the colds for sniffles, to rush to surgery, and so on. And a certain amount of doing is always valuable and can even be life-saving. But doing must also be supplemented by being, looking inward, examining, and asking. In 1987, I experienced the worst pain I have ever known. I developed a herniated disc and could neither walk nor stand. I consulted an expert neurologist and a skilled neurosurgeon. Their advice? Get off your feet and go to bed. If things aren't better in a month, have surgery to remove the disc. Things got worse. Even in bed, the slightest movement would trigger waves of pain that were almost unbearable. I knew most of the practitioners of alternative forms of health care in my area, and when they heard of my difficulty, they came to my aid by the dozens. My wife had to resort to a formal scheduling procedure to manage the constant stream of acupuncturists, psychic healers, prayer therapists, homeopaths, nutritionists, hands-on healers, and chiropractors. I was really grateful for the love and the attention my friends freely gave to me. Eventually, however, my feelings changed. I began to experience an intense craving for solitude. To my surprise, I began to resent the bright, sunny, positive assurances that I'd be well in no time, and that each particular therapy was the key to my healing. One day, my dear friend, Jean Ochterberg, called and said, "Getting tired of all the therapy? I went through this years ago," she said. "Eventually, I felt like a big jungle cat who's injured. I wanted to hide in a dark cave and lick my wounds until my situation resolved itself, one way or the other." Jean was reading my mind. She helped me acknowledge my increasing resistance to the ministrations of my friends. I soon found myself withdrawing into my own cave. Many of my friends didn't appreciate this. The period of withdrawal and solitude was highly illuminating for me. I kept an extensive journal, and my wife rigged a bedside table that enabled me to use my word processor while flat in bed. The weeks of pain proved, ironically, to be one of the most fertile writing periods of my life. I began to realize that this immensely trying experience had a hidden dimension that wasn't all bad. I wondered if my book would have remained unfinished had I continued to receive alternative treatments. Prayer takes many forms. Many people follow the formalities of the great religions and pray explicitly for specific events to happen. Others do not pray in any conventional sense, but live with the deeply interiorized sense of the sacred. Theirs could be called a spirit of prayerfulness. Prayer has a tendency to ask for definite outcomes, to tell God what to do, to take the cancer away, for instance. Prayerfulness, on the other hand, is more willing to tolerate ambiguity. It honors the rightness of whatever happens, even cancer. Prayerfulness allows us to reach a plane of experience where illness can be experienced as a natural part of life. If the disease disappears, we're grateful. If it remains, that too is reason for gratitude. The attitude of gratitude during illness is captured in the following curious story. At the turn of the 20th century, there was a religious group in Mysore, India, headed by a famous holy man who was afflicted with chills from malaria. The Swami used to take his morning bath in the temple pond. Then, wearing his wet garment, he offered his prayers. When the chills got particularly bad, he would remove the wet cloth and toss it in a corner. The wet garment would continue to shiver and shake, while the Swami would be free of chills and able to offer his prayers. Once his prayers were completed, he would pick up the cloth from the corner and again wrap it around himself, which would bring the shivers back to him. When asked why he did not leave off the cloth permanently, he replied it was a sufficient blessing that for short periods he could get away from his physical symptoms so he could perform his ritual worship. On becoming ill, many people adopt a spiritual way of being with a hidden agenda to rid themselves of disease. However, spirituality is not a commodity to be used during illness like a drug. Get-well formulas that advocate spiritual practices are by definition inauthentic because they require that one take on spirituality from the outside instead of allowing it to emerge from the center of one's own being. One must go beyond all formulas, all paths, all programs, and give up all ulterior wishes, including perhaps the hope that the cancer or some other sickness disappears. Many New Age health authorities imply that cancer or other illnesses arise because of imperfections in the patient's life. If he or she can somehow summon the courage and honesty to set the defects right, the miracle can take place. This approach is what Jungian psychologist James Hillman calls the rainmaker fantasy, the shamanic idea that once the rainmaker puts himself in order, the rain falls. Translated into New Age health thinking, if I really straighten myself out, the disease will disappear. If the cure does not occur, the person did not try hard enough or did not really want to be cured. Yet in the course of illness, there is still a sense in which a cure can always occur. And by cure, I don't mean the physical disappearance of cancer or heart disease, high blood pressure, or a stroke, but something really much more marvelous, the realization that physical illness, no matter how painful or grotesque, is of secondary importance in the total scheme of our existence. In order to demonstrate that prayer-related healing fits into medical science, let's drop back to the 19th century when medicine first became scientific. Prior to that time, almost everything physicians did to help patients, leeching or bleeding, for example, was either ineffective or actually harmful. If we begin at that historical moment and come forward to the present, we can sort out three historical eras that embody fundamentally different approaches to illness and healing. Era 1, which began in the last third of the 19th century, can be called the era of materialistic or physicalistic medicine. It encompasses the discovery and the practice of therapies that largely dominate Western medicine today. Era 1 medicine is guided by the classical laws of matter and energy that Sir Isaac Newton described in the 17th century. According to these laws, the universe is a vast clockwork that functions according to causal principles. If they're going to be effective, all forms of therapy must embody these physicalistic assumptions. Sometime following World War II, another unique period in the history of Western medicine began to take shape, Era 2, or so-called mind-body medicine. Although mind-body approaches had existed since antiquity, at long last they began to be studied scientifically. It became possible to show, for instance, that perceptions and emotions and attitudes and thoughts and perceived meanings profoundly affect the body. Both eras 1 and 2 are entirely local in emphasis. That is, both of them consider the mind to be localized to points in space, such as the brain and body, and in time, such as the present moment. Era 3 medicine is the first form to make use of a non-local approach to the relationship of mind, body, and time. That is, It does not regard the mind as localized within an individual human brain or body or confined to the present moment. In the Era 3 view, minds are spread throughout space and time. One particular implication of this view is that human consciousness is unbounded. This is a high anomaly. It does not conform to our familiar constructions of reality. Why should medicine be concerned about high anomalies? Because these events can and do affect the body in dramatic ways. Anything that affects the body, whether bacterium, virus, drug, or prayer, is the legitimate concern of medicine. As we shall see, numerous controlled studies have validated the non-local nature of prayer. Much of this evidence suggests that praying individuals can purposefully affect the physiology of distant people without the receiver's awareness. Let's look at an example of a non-local event that is medically relevant. In 1985, Dr. Norman Shealy, a Harvard-trained neurosurgeon and researcher, began to work with journalist Carolyn Myss. Since childhood, Myss had had an intuitive ability to simply know things. Dr. Shealy asked her to put her intuitive skills to work in diagnosing illness in his patients. With a patient in his office in Missouri, he would phone Myss in New Hampshire, some 1,200 miles away. Myss would then enter the patient's body intuitively, examining the relative health of each organ system. According to Shealy's data, Myss is 93% accurate. Even with sophisticated diagnostic tools such as blood analyses and x-rays, medical diagnosticians seldom achieve these levels of accuracy in the earliest phase of diagnosis. Since antiquity, there have been healers for whom the degree of spatial separation from the patient is reputed to be inconsequential. Also ancient is the practice of the laying on of hands, in which physical contact takes place between healer and healee. In landmark research by nursing academician Dolores Krieger, a healer's hands are held a short distance from the patient's body. This technique is called therapeutic touch. To evaluate this technique, researcher Daniel P. Worth performed a double-blind study involving 44 patients with artificially created skin wounds. The patients would insert the arm with the wound through a cutout aperture in the wall of the facility beyond which they couldn't see for 5 minutes. A therapeutic touch practitioner was present in the adjoining room for members of the active treatment group, but the room was vacant during the procedure periods for the remaining patients. The results were highly significant. 16 days later, 13 of the 23 treated subjects were completely healed, that is to say, their wound size was 0, compared with none of the untreated group. This study indicated that non-contact therapeutic touch is effective even if the subject is unaware of its occurrence. Research in the field of psychosomatic medicine has demonstrated beyond reasonable doubt that disturbances in the mind can cause bodily dysfunction and disease within an individual. But if the mind is non-local and thus shared, the possibility arises that mental events can trigger happenings between individuals as well. These phenomena have been called telesomatic. Telesomatic comes from Greek words meaning the distant body. Examples are legion. Arthur Severin, a well-known British landscape painter, went out for an early morning sail while his wife was still asleep. She was suddenly awakened at about 7 a.m. by a blow to her lip, which was so violent she immediately began to look for blood. To her surprise, she found none. Later in the morning, when her husband returned for breakfast, he was holding a handkerchief to his bleeding lips, having been hit in the mouth at about 7 a.m., when the boat's tiller swung in a gust of wind. In 1892, British Major General T. Blaxley reported a case involving a close soldier friend who felt unaccountably ill one morning. On their way to the firing ranges, his friend said, on the basis of sheer intuition, "My twin brother died this morning at 8 o'clock, and I know that the effect on me will be a serious illness." General Blaxley tried to persuade the man he had been dreaming. "No," his friend insisted. "Through our lives, there's been always such a strong sympathy between us that nothing has ever happened to one without the other knowing about it." His presentiments proved correct. He came down with an attack of jaundice. The news came in due course that his brother had indeed died at the time he had stated. It's true that these events are anecdotes. One cannot compel them to happen in the laboratory so they can be studied under close scrutiny. In spite of these limitations, however, I believe telesomatic events deserve our attention for two basic reasons. First, they're extraordinarily commonplace. And second, they exhibit an internal consistency from case to case. Almost all these cases happen between people who are empathic, people who are emotionally close. And also, telesomatic events frequently convey information of life or death importance. There can be surprising pressure, even from within organized religions, to suppress spontaneous experiences of this sort. In a letter written to Don Lorenzo de Cepeda in 1577, St. Teresa of Avila said, "I've had raptures again. They are most embarrassing. Several times in public, I'm so ashamed I simply want to hide away somewhere." In some traditions, such as Zen Buddhism, non-local, mystical-type experiences are not suppressed, but neither are they encouraged because it's felt that they can distract from more important spiritual work. For example, a Zen master, after listening to one of his students report on the vision of light and true Buddhahood he had experienced during meditation, responded soberly, "Keep meditating. It will go away." Or as Suzuki Roshi said, "What do you want to get enlightened for? You may not like it." Carol was one of the healthiest patients I had ever seen. She never came to see me except for routine exams, which were few and far between. Like many people interested in a holistic approach, Carol prided herself on taking full responsibility for her health and for consciously creating her own reality. One night at 3 a.m., I was called to the emergency room. There lay Carol on a stretcher, barely conscious and near death. Her abdomen was rigid and tender, indicating some type of intra-abdominal catastrophe. After a few tests, she was taken to surgery, where she was successfully operated on for a ruptured appendix. A few days later, I went by her hospital room. "Carol, why didn't you call me? You must have known something was wrong." Immediately, she began to sob. "Because I was so ashamed, I felt like a complete failure." Carol's heroic task of fashioning her reality through her conscious efforts had failed. Her world lay crumbled all about her. Today, increasing numbers of people strive, like Carol, to use consciousness in the task of remaining healthy or getting well. These efforts frequently involve prayer, either praying for oneself or enlisting the prayers of others. Enthusiasts seem largely to deny the obvious. No approach works 100% of the time. Not prayer, not imagery, not visualization, not surgery or irradiation are the most potent miracle drugs. To rely on a single approach, no matter how philosophically or metaphysically attractive it might be, is to court disaster. Positive thinking has side effects, and the force-feeding of hope is being increasingly criticized as dangerous. When someone speaks of their consciousness, as in when they claim that they're using their consciousness to create their own health reality, they're almost invariably referring to the part of the mind that is aware. One of the practically unchallenged facts of modern psychology, however, is that we live the vast bulk of our psychic lives not in awareness, but in unawareness or unconsciousness. If we're not even aware of the larger part of our psyche and what it may be doing, how then can we claim total conscious responsibility for what happens in our life, including our health? It's extremely odd that the role of the unconscious rarely comes up when people talk about the place of the mind in health. Perhaps it's because we don't trust the unconscious. Many people see it as a sinister force, a dark repository of unacceptable, unflattering thoughts and emotions. Sigmund Freud is largely responsible for this picture. Freud maintained the unconscious is the region of the id, a domain of psychic forces compelling us to hate our mother or father, among other things. Other explorers of the psyche saw the unconscious differently. Jung, for instance, saw the unconscious as the home of archetypes. He felt that every psychic force has its opposite in the unconscious. The force of light is always counterposed with that of darkness, good with evil, love with hate, on and on. Jung believed that any psychic energy could get out of hand and become unbalanced. There could even be too much harmony and goodness in human beings. The goal of a lifetime, Jung maintained, is to achieve a dynamic balance of the innate opposites and to make this balancing process as conscious as possible. The unconscious can be extraordinarily helpful and benevolent in our quest for health. In fact, the unconscious mind can cooperate with prayer and even mediate the effects. But we should prepare ourselves for some surprises. Even though the unconscious may strive mightily to ensure our survival during moments of crisis such as grave illness, it does so on its own terms. Let's look at some examples. The most effective psychological coping strategy in the acute hospital phase of a heart attack is denial. I must caution that before one reaches the hospital, denial can be dangerous and even fatal. Genuine denial wells up from the unconscious and is highly illogical. A physician may say to a patient lying in the coronary care unit, "Joe, you've had a heart attack, the most classic heart attack I've ever seen." Joe listens and then says, "I appreciate your concern, doctor, but this is just muscle pain or indigestion. I'm too young. Nobody in my family has ever had a heart attack. Look, I've got a busy schedule at the office." Even though this response is irrational, studies have shown that people who use it survive in greater numbers than those who confront the facts squarely and honestly. How does denial work? Researchers believe it allays anxiety because the patient doesn't believe the heart attack is real. This in turn leads to lower blood levels of adrenaline, a calmer blood pressure and heart rate, and decreased irregularities in the heartbeat. Thus, the unconscious seems to set in motion, through denial, a pattern of physical responses tailor-made for survival. Almost everyone is afraid before undergoing major surgery. Many of our anxieties are lodged in the unconscious. Try as we may to shut them out, they erupt unexpectedly in those quiet interludes when the conscious mind lets its guard down. British psychologist Anne Monyande and her colleagues examined blood levels of two stress hormones, adrenaline and cortisol, in patients just before surgery, in the recovery room, and on the 2 days following surgery. These stress hormones are believed to contribute to weight loss, fatigue, and impaired immune function surrounding major surgery. They found that stress hormone levels increased significantly only in those patients who were given relaxation training for their anxieties prior to surgery. In patients not taught coping strategies, the hormone levels remain normal. Peter Salmon, one of the researchers, believes that relaxation training may distract people from focusing constructively on their upcoming surgery. He says, "Our hypothesis is that thinking about and preparing for a stressful event is a better tactic. If we wipe out all the noxious feelings and emotions, we may stop thinking of ways to deal with pain and immobility, what the illness means, and so on. The body seemingly needs a bit of worry and fear before surgery, and our unconscious mind seems to know this fully." This study doesn't stand alone. At the University of Cincinnati Medical School, researchers have found that the pregnant woman who has anxiety-ridden and threatening dream images about her baby usually experiences a shorter and easier labor than those women whose dream images are full of happier, more pleasant images. Dream researchers Jane Gackenbach and Jane Boswell say, "It's as if the threatening dreams acknowledge the painful event that's to come, while the more pleasant dreams deny that reality." In Antarctica, in July 1989, 6 men, each from a different nation, began the first unmechanized trek across the Antarctic continent. For 220 days, the group endured storms, winds up to 90 miles an hour, and temperatures as low as minus 43 degrees Fahrenheit. 2 days before the completion of their journey, a blinding snowstorm arose. At 4:30 in the afternoon, 32-year-old Kizo Funatsu of Japan walked a few yards from the camp in the blizzard to feed his huskies. Although the men had staked skis and poles every few yards between the tents, which was a common precaution in such conditions, Funatsu lost his way. Realizing his precarious situation, he took immediate measures for survival. This is how he later described his experience in his journal. Once I was in my snow ditch. Blowing snow covered me in 5-10 seconds. I could breathe through a cavity close to my body. I knew my teammates would be looking for me. I had to believe this. I said to myself, settle down, try and enjoy this. With the snow and quiet covering me, I felt like I was in my mother's womb. My life seemed very small compared to nature, to Antarctica. At 6 a.m. the next day, Funatsu, unhurt, heard the searchers calling his name. He emerged from his snowy 13-and-a-half-hour burial and stood up, shouting, "I'm alive! I am alive!" Funatsu realized that to do anything would have meant almost certain death. He could only wait patiently to see what the universe would deliver. His being strategy paid off with survival. People undergoing radical, spontaneous healing events are usually not desperate for a miracle to occur. They're not trying at any cost to extract a radical healing from the universe. They have a quality of acceptance and gratitude as if things are quite all right in spite of their disease or problem. Some people would respond to this point of view by saying, "You want us to be completely passive, to give up, to ignore our own efforts to improve our health." Well, this is a misunderstanding. Relying on the power of the unconscious does not mean we must abandon all voluntary effort. Neither does it mean we should forego surgery, medications, and other modern forms of intervention. When we pray, we ought always to bear in mind the desires of the unconscious. But if they're indeed unconscious, how can we know them? One of the best ways is to pay attention to our dreams. As a child, one of the most puzzling pieces of advice I ever heard shouted from the pulpit was the exhortation to pray unceasing. I was immensely puzzled how any human being could pray continually, and I recall wondering if it were possible to pray during one's dreams. I had no idea, of course, that certain people throughout history have indeed believed that dream prayer is possible. In his book, Prayer, Finding the Heart's True Home, Richard J. Foster observes that St. Francis fit this description. He seemed not so much a man praying as prayer itself made man. Today we equate prayer almost exclusively with waking awareness and rationality. That prayer might occur in the depths of the unconscious may seem preposterous, and the possibility that our unconscious might know how to pray better than our conscious mind is simply not entertained. But why shouldn't prayer be part of the repertoire of the unconscious? If prayer is a valuable activity, should not the bulk of our psyche wish to participate in it? One of the bedrock tenets of Jung's psychology is that there is an intrinsic drive toward wholeness and integration within the psyche of all people. This urge to oneness is quintessentially spiritual. In its most highly developed form, this feeling is expressed by mystics as the divine union, or merging with the absolute. Jung maintained that something similar occurs in the unconscious during sleep and dreams. If the urge toward oneness and unity and wholeness lies at the heart of prayer, and if this urge erupts consistently during dreams when the unconscious takes the stage, we must consider seriously that we pray unconsciously night after night. Dream prayer may indeed be our most effective prayer, because it occurs when the inhibitions and distractions of waking awareness have abated. Unobstructed, the unconscious during sleep may be free to realize its natural, innate affinity with the divine. One of the most common forms of prayer is for healing. If prayer and dreams are related, can dreams heal? For years, psychologist Sandra Ingerman endured a painful problem that medical specialists declared untreatable. Desperate for a solution, Ingerman prayed every night before going to bed for help to come to her in a dream. Months later, she dreamt she was in her house when suddenly a young, handsome Native American appeared from behind her couch holding a rattle made of blue skin. He pointed to the place in her body where she experienced her pain and, after telling her that she had a problem there, shook his rattle over the area. At that moment, she felt the pain leave her body and knew even while dreaming that she had experienced a cure. When she awakened, the pain was indeed gone. 10 years hence, it hasn't returned. Joseph, a professional writer from San Francisco, describes a healing dream involving his typewriter. It malfunctioned, and he scheduled a service appointment with a technician for the following day. That night, the repairman appeared in Joseph's dream, told him he was sick and could not come, and gave specific instructions about how Joseph could make the necessary repairs himself. On waking, Joseph learned that the technician had indeed called in sick. With the instructions still fresh in his mind, he went to his typewriter, opened it, found the problem exactly as it had appeared in the dream, and made the repairs. Dreams of unity, wholeness, and healing can bring about healthy changes within our bodies, but can we pray successfully during our dreams for someone else? In the Soviet Union during the 1920s, the Commission for the Study of Mental Suggestion conducted a series of experiments in which a sender attempted to convey visual images to a receiver in a separate room. When the experiment began, the sender would focus on one of three objects, examining its details. The visual imagery that entered the mind of the receiver was usually filled with separate details or symbols of the object. For example, if the sender were focusing on the face of a pocket watch, the receiver perceived a circle, a thought about figures, and so on. Psychologist Christine Comstock points out that Freud believed that communication between people could take place entirely on an unconscious level. Comstock maintains that unconscious to unconscious communication is the basis for exchanges of information at a distance. If so, there seems no reason why we cannot pray for others during our dreams. Researchers Stanley Krippner and Montague Ullman experimented for a decade with dream telepathy. Volunteers spent one or more nights in a sleep laboratory and were awakened when their brain waves and eye movements indicated they were dreaming. In some experiments, they would attempt to dream about a picture postcard that would be randomly selected the following day. One night, Repast of the Lion, which is a painting by Henri Rousseau, was selected as the dream target. In it, a lion is biting into the body of a smaller animal. The dreamer had several dreams about violence and animals. If an image on a postcard can get through, why not prayer? Healing events sometimes indeed suggest that prayer for healing originated in the unconscious mind during sleep. Psychologist Lawrence Lashan, an avid experimenter and authority in distant healing, relates the following incident. A man I knew asked me to do a distance healing for an extremely painful condition requiring immediate and intensive surgery. I promised to do the healing that night, and the next morning when he awoke, a miraculous cure had occurred. The medical specialist was astounded and offered to send me pre- and post-healing x-rays. It would have been the psychic healing case of the century, except for one small detail. In the press of overwork, I had forgotten to do the healing. It seems likely that the patient's request for prayer was not dismissed altogether, but shoved to the back of Lashan's mind. If so, it could have emerged during sleep to cause Lashan to experience prayerful concern for the man's situation, which he did not remember on waking. There are other possibilities. Someone else might have been praying for the man's healing, or he might have been praying for himself. Or this may have been a profound example of time-displaced prayer, prayer occurring in the future that's shaping the present. The question arises whether it is ethical to pray for another if the recipient is unaware the prayer is being employed. Some people, including some scientists, maintain that one should never pray for another without his or her consent. Institutional review committees, whose job it is to oversee the design of experiments involving human beings, have sometimes insisted that the subjects in prayer experiments be told they're being prayed for before the experiment begins. Should we always obtain consent before praying for another? What does consent really mean? Whatever answer people consciously give about whether or not they wish to be prayed for, It's their unconscious mind that may have the final say. How then should we proceed? Perhaps the Buddhist injunction, "have good intent," is the best guide, or the Christian equivalent, "do unto others as you would have them do unto you." I maintain that as long as our efforts are filled with compassion, caring, and love, there's little reason to fear that praying for others without their consent is unethical. One of the most common beliefs about prayer is that it's sent to someone in need, or to the Almighty who forwards the desired effect. We embody these images when we make comments such as, "I'll be praying for you and sending you energy." But there is no evidence whatsoever that energy of any kind is involved in prayer. If prayer were a conventional form of energy, it should weaken as distance is increased, and this doesn't happen. This strongly suggests that prayer may not go anywhere at all. If prayer doesn't go anywhere, then it may simultaneously be present everywhere, enveloping the sender, the object, and the Almighty all at once. Physicists have a word to describe a world in which information is not sent, but exists everywhere all at once. That word is non-local. Although this kind of world may sound like science fiction, a reality of this sort has been proved to exist in modern physics. This development rests largely on an idea in subatomic physics called Bell's theorem, introduced in 1964 by the Irish physicist John Stuart Bell. Bell showed that if distant objects have once been in contact, a change thereafter in one causes an immediate change in the other, no matter how far apart they are. Some physicists believe that non-locality applies not just to the domain of electrons and other subatomic particles, but also to the mind. In my book, Recovering the Soul, I discussed evidence from a wide variety of sources suggesting that consciousness is non-local. The non-local view suggests that the mind cannot be limited to specific points in space, such as brains or bodies, or in time, such as the present moment, but is infinite in space and time. Thus the mind is omnipresent, eternal, and immortal. If minds are indeed non-local, this means that in principle they cannot be walled off from one another. At some level, they are one. A well-known authority on prayer was giving a seminar. A man in the audience raised his hand and boldly asked, "Doctor, how should I pray?" "Oh, it's very simple," she said. "Ask God." This man's question reveals a widespread belief that there is a best way to pray. Is there? Experimenters are reluctant to dictate how one should communicate with the Absolute, and methods employed are practically never described in their experimental reports. Why do some people prefer a single prayer word, others a short phrase, and still others elaborate soliloquies? Many theologians, religious scholars, and psychologists have turned their attention to modern psychology in search of answers. Swiss psychologist Carl Jung described the human personality this way. On one side, there are extroverts, outer-directed, action-oriented people, and on the other side are introverts, who are more inner-directed and contemplative. Jung found 4 other major personality differences as well, which he called the 4 functions. 2 were rational functions, feeling and thinking. Feeling was akin to the word evaluating. The other 2 were non-rational, intuition and sensation. Psychologist June Singer states, Jung seemed to believe that these differences might be present at birth as part of the psychological constitution of the infant. Parents who do not understand that there can be innate differences in the temperament of children may see their child as being somehow wrong, and may try to force the child into a style of behavior to which he or she is not by nature inclined. In this situation, Singer maintains, a neurosis will almost always occur. If parents can make children neurotic by failing to honor their innate psychological predispositions, what about those we trust to parent the soul and the spirit, our priests, our ministers, and rabbis? If they exert pressure for everyone to conform to a certain prayer style, and if they see nonconformists as misguided or sinful, a prayer neurosis can develop. People feel guilty and inadequate, incapable of true prayer, estranged and out of step with their religion. The Venerable Augustine Baker, a 17th century Benedictine contemplative, knew clearly that different people were predisposed to different methods in approaching the absolute. In the following revealing passage, which was written almost 4 centuries before Jung, he seems to be describing extroverts and introverts. Those souls who have not a propensity to the interior must abide always in the exercises in which sensible images are used. These souls will find the sensible exercises very profitable to themselves and to others and pleasing to God. But others, who have the propensity to the interior, do not always remain in the exercises of the senses, but will give place to the exercises of the Spirit, which consist simply of the elevation of the soul to God. As an incurable introvert, I have recoiled all my life at being told by extroverts how to pray. After growing up in a religious tradition that was highly extroverted, I recall the joy I experienced on discovering the contemplative, inner-directed traditions of the East. Concepts such as the Tao, the perfect way of nature that is indwelling, invisible, and silent, struck a chord long silent in my heart. And the Eastern idea of enlightenment, waking up to what already is present, seemed utterly natural and true to me. These concepts seem to require not action or doing, but understanding, something that held immense appeal to me. Some people don't like this hands-off approach to prayer. It seems too passive, but this may represent a genuinely benevolent feature of our world. We should give thanks that we don't necessarily have to furnish wisdom or foresight to the universe. The requisite information is already present and does not depend on us. The Spindrift organization in Lansdale, Pennsylvania, has for a decade performed simple laboratory experiments showing that prayer works. Having proved that prayer is effective, they proceeded to investigate which type of prayer strategy works best. One of their most important contributions is the distinction they make between directed and non-directed prayer. Practitioners of directed prayer have a specific goal or outcome in mind. They may be praying for the cancer to be cured, the heart attack to resolve itself, or the pain to go away. Non-directed prayer, in contrast, is an open-ended approach. The practitioner does not attempt to tell the universe what to do. Spindrift devised an experiment to put directed and non-directed prayer to the test in a study involving mold on laboratory plates. The mold was damaged by washing it in an alcohol rinse. A string was then placed across the mold, marking it into sides A, the control side, and B, the treated or prayed for side. When directed prayer was used to encourage the growth of side B, nothing happened. Growth remained static. But when directed prayer was replaced by non-directed prayer, in which no goal was held in the mind of the healer, side B began to multiply. As a result of numerous tests, the Spindrift researchers suggest healers will be most effective if they strive to be completely free of visualizations or specific goals. An obvious question arises concerning non-directed prayer. If one does not pray for a specific result, how can one tell if the prayer is answered? Spindrift believes, on the basis of a large number of tests, that when a non-directed prayer is answered, the outcome is always in the direction of what's best for the organism. This was demonstrated in a series of germination experiments in which the practitioner did not know what was best for the seeds involved. One batch was over-soaked and thus heavier than it should have been for proper germination to occur, and another batch was under-soaked and lighter than optimal. Ideally, the over-soaked seeds should have eliminated excess water and become lighter, and the under-soaked seeds should have absorbed water and become heavier. Not knowing which batch was which, the practitioner could not tell the seeds what to do, so he used non-directed prayer and trusted that the seeds would simply move toward the norm. The non-directed approach worked. The results showed that the oversoaked beans eliminated water and lost weight, and the undersoaked beans gained water and increased their weight. On the basis of this type of experiment, Spindrift believes that an answered non-directed prayer is one in which the organism moves toward those states of form and function that are healthiest for it. I am personally uncertain about generalizing these conclusions to human beings. What is best for the individual may sometimes involve death, not life. It's not easy to employ a non-directed prayer strategy. When our health fails, we usually waste no time telling the universe what to do. We want the cancer to vanish. We want the pain to subside, the high blood pressure to resolve, and so on. Even if we try to follow a non-directed approach, we often have a hidden agenda. I'll pray non-directedly, but I wouldn't mind a cure. In discussing these findings in lectures and seminars, I find that many people who have favored the directed approach to prayer and visualization often jump to hasty conclusions on hearing the Spindrift experiments. They say to themselves, I must be praying wrong. I should switch to the non-directed approach. Spindrift's most important contribution, however, is showing that prayer simply works, not that everyone should suddenly start praying, imaging, and visualizing identically. Non-directed prayer strategies are not to be equated with a completely blank state of mind. Certain Buddhist schools advocate clear mind as a goal in meditation, yet they employ techniques that are rich in mental imagery. In one mind-clearing exercise, we're asked to imagine sitting quietly by a stream. When a thought comes, imagine it's a floating log. Observe the log floating nearer, and finally, let it float away downstream. The goal is not to fight the images, but simply not to be pushed around and dominated by them. The Mind Science Foundation in San Antonio, Texas, employs 5 simple but powerful techniques that expand considerably the concepts of directedness versus non-directedness in prayer. These are relaxation, attention training, imagery and visualization, intentionality, and strong positive emotions. Everyone has heard of dramatic examples of healing in which highly specific, directed strategies were used in imagery and prayer. Such as one well-known example in which the person imaged her cancer as a piece of red meat and her immune cells as a pack of ravenous wolves who attacked the meat and destroyed it. Another successful imagery motif involved visualizing cancer cells as helpless, frightened fish and the immune cells as voracious sharks feeding on them. Although stories such as these do not count as hard evidence, we'd be foolish to ignore them. In their support, there is ample solid scientific evidence that directed, highly specific imagery can bring about changes in the body. For instance, Dr. Howard Hall of Pennsylvania State University has shown that subjects using hypnosis can generate a more active immune response when they imagine that their white blood cells are strong and powerful sharks. Dr. G. Richard Smith and his colleagues at the University of Arkansas College of Medicine reported what is perhaps the first fully documented case of a human being intentionally changing the immune system. It involved a 39-year-old woman who was able to change her positive skin test for the varicella-zoster virus, which causes chickenpox, at will from positive toward negative. She used specific imagery, imagining the redness and the swelling surrounding the skin test getting smaller and smaller while sending healing energy to the area. The belief in the power of words is universal and is embodied in creation myths worldwide. In the beginning was the Word, we say in the West. Many traditions maintain that if we're to know God, we must become involved with the language of God. Yet there has always been a competing point of view, emphasizing the value not of words, but of silence. Chuang Tzu, who helped craft the tenets of Taoism in ancient China over 2 millennia ago, suggested that the most profound forms of communication go beyond words. He said, "Words exist because of meaning. Once you've got the meaning, you can forget the words." Because we have so little tolerance for quiet, silence and prayer seem incompatible to most people. It wasn't always so, As the anonymous author of The Cloud of Unknowing once wrote, "A man or woman, frightened by fire or death, bursts out in terror with one little word, fire, it may be, or help. Short prayer penetrates heaven." If scientists suddenly discovered a drug as powerful as love in creating health, it would be heralded as a medical breakthrough and marketed overnight. Love is intimately related with health. One survey of 10,000 men with heart disease found a 50% reduction in frequency of chest pain in men who perceive their wives as supportive and loving. The power of love to change bodies is legendary, built into folklore and everyday experience. Throughout history, tender loving care has uniformly been recognized as a valuable element in healing. But can love unite people over geographical distances, even when the receiver is unaware that love is being offered? Virtually all psychic healers who use prayer believe so. Most state emphatically that love is the power making it possible for them to heal at a distance. During attempts at healing, healers generally feel infused by love and transformed by caring. This feeling is so pronounced that they typically describe becoming one with the person being prayed for. In addition to the belief of healers that love is vital if prayer is to get through, considerable evidence, both laboratory-based and anecdotal, suggests that empathy somehow connects distant organisms. These entities are of a vastly different variety, ranging from microorganisms to human beings. If empathy indeed connects a vast range of living things, it may be a built-in feature of the natural world. Empathy, compassion, and love seem to form a literal bond, a resonance or glue between living things. When empathic connections are present, feelings experienced by one entity may be also felt by another in spite of separation. J.B. Ryan and Sarah Feather of the Parapsychology Laboratory at Duke University collected 54 returning animal cases. In one case, a young boy named Hugh Brady, who kept homing pigeons as pets, found a wounded pigeon in the garden of his home. Hugh nursed the bird back to health and gave him an identification tag marked number 167. The next winter, Hugh became suddenly ill and was rushed to a hospital 200 miles away and underwent surgery. While still recovering, he heard a tapping at the window. Hugh summoned a nurse and asked her to open it. In flew a pigeon, which landed with a flutter on Hugh's chest. He identified his bird immediately by the tag number. Pigeons are well known, of course, for their homing ability, but number 167 wasn't homing. He was traveling to a place he had never been. Not only does empathy influence relationships between living things, it's apparently involved in human-machine interactions. Researchers at the Princeton Engineering Anomalies Research Laboratory at Princeton University have studied the ability of people to influence physical events occurring in different mechanical devices, such as a microelectronic random event generator, or REG. A human operator sits in front of this device, views a sequence of numbers, and tries to will the machine's output up or down. Results indicate that both individuals and couples working in concert can influence the REG. But the most successful pairs are couples who are deeply attached emotionally. These studies also show that the effects of empathic bonding transcend time. In a remarkable variation of these experiments, experimenters asked the operators to influence the output of the REG device before it actually ran. The results were the same as if they had been trying to influence its behavior while it was running in real time. Does empathy help prayer get through? Getting through presumes that there is such a thing as a separate person fundamentally isolated from every other. Eminent parapsychology researcher Stanley Krippner states, all consciousness is group consciousness. An individual's awareness, attention, memory, etc., is socially constructed. Without group interaction, an individual would never achieve identification with anyone or anything. So if unity and not separation is fundamental, then at some level of the psyche, nothing may be getting through because there are no separate parts for something to get through to. If this is so, the connections we feel with others during prayer are really nothing special. We do not have to establish or invent these connections because they already exist. Prayer is not an innovation. It's a process of remembering who we really are and how we're related. Of all the trivialized concepts in this so-called New Age, perhaps the greatest involves love. Books pour from the pens of well-meaning patients and doctors alike, attesting to its phenomenal power in healing. If we could only learn to love and forgive ourselves and others and let go of all of our fear and hatred, our health would be better. The frenzied enthusiasm surrounding love has led to one of the greatest ironies of the New Age, namely, that significant numbers of sick people are made to feel guilty in the name of love for not being well. About 10 years ago, a patient of mine developed a breast lump and had a mammogram and breast biopsy, which revealed cancer. Considerably shaken, she sought help from a psychological counselor well known for dealing with newly diagnosed cancer patients. On my patient's first visit, the counselor, without bothering to inquire deeply about her history and psychological makeup, stated abruptly, "There are only 3 possibilities for why you have cancer. You either don't love yourself enough, you have some deep-seated fear you're not in touch with, or you're not trusting enough of yourself and others." Deeply introspective, my patient felt the counselor's observations were simply wrong. Having cancer is difficult enough without the guilt trip, she said. So she rejected his analysis and found help elsewhere. 10 years later, after using orthodox cancer therapy as well as continued inner psychological work, she has no trace of illness. This is not to suggest that I don't believe in the role of love in healing. As I've explained, I believe it is vastly important, particularly in prayer-based healing. I only want to point out that love should not be enshrined as some magical monolithic principle in health and healing. When it is, the sick person often pays. At some point, one wants simply to stand up and demand of all the love merchants, "What do you mean by love?" A lot of New Age literature has stripped love of its complexity and has sanitized it into something nice that can be made into a simplified formula that everybody can understand. Love's mysterious, darker qualities are relegated to the shadows or completely ignored. The Old Testament story of Job is about the shadow side of love and how one can be victimized by a loving God. Job's story should be required reading for those who today insist on linking spiritual perfection and health, because it shows that horrible things can happen to blameless people. We're told at the outset that Job was perfect and upright. Job chapter 1, verse 1. He did nothing to deserve his fate. But in spite of Job's perfection, God allowed terrible things to be done to him. His 10 children were killed, his wealth was destroyed, his health was replaced by disfiguring, painful disease. If we believe that God is love, then we're forced to conclude that love must be an extremely complex phenomenon. Things haven't changed much since Job's time. People who are highly spiritual, God-realized, and enlightened still become ill. In order to keep God's skirts clean, as philosopher Alan Watts once put it, we hear various rationales for these troubling events. Some people say that the sick person only appears loving, but deep down, real problems exist that he or she isn't in touch with. What do we really know about the place of love in healing? We can demonstrate experimentally that love, compassion, caring, and empathy catalyze healing events, and that this power operates at a distance and apparently outside of time. But we know also that love is compatible with illness, in the same sense in which Jesus said, "Love your enemies," not "don't have any." Love occupies a majestic place in healing. Lying outside space and time, it's a living tissue of reality, a bond that unites us all. In 1955, a West German physician reported a strange series of events in 3 of his patients. One had chronic inflammation of the gallbladder with stones. The second had failed to recuperate from a major abdominal operation and was practically a skeleton, and the third was dying of widespread cancer. The physician permitted a prominent local faith healer to try to cure them without the patient's knowledge. Nothing happened. Then he told the patients about the faith healer and assured them that the healer would be treating them from a distance at a certain time the very next day. This was a time in which he was sure the healer did not work. At the suggested time, all 3 patients improved quickly and dramatically. The second was permanently cured. The other 2 were not, but showed striking temporary responses. Why did the 3 patients improve? Several factors may have acted alone or in combination. The placebo effect, the power of suggestion in the patients themselves, may have been at work. The faith healer's initial action may have had a real but delayed effect. Or the faith healer may have continued to exert his activities even though the physician thought he had not. Or the belief of the physician may somehow have brought about the improvements. Let's focus on this last possibility. Because it's generally agreed that a patient's attitudes are crucial to his or her response to treatment, it's usually only the patient's beliefs that are considered when a particular therapy is entered. The beliefs of the patient, however, are only one side of the coin. The physician's beliefs also shape the outcome of therapy. It's widely known that physicians can fool themselves when they try to determine why patients get better. They may attribute the patient's response solely to the administered drug, when the improvement has actually resulted from suggestion. In order to eliminate this confusion, elaborate experimental methods have been developed, the most common of which is the famous double-blind. In a double-blind situation, experimental subjects don't know which group they belong to, whether to the experimental group being given the active drug or to the control group being given a placebo. Neither does the experimenter know which group is which, or who's receiving what. This means that both the experimenter and the subjects are blinded, hence double-blind. One of the results of these sorts of studies has been the discovery of the power of placebos to bring about dramatic improvements, due, it is always said, to the patient's belief that he or she is ingesting some powerful substance. But any healing transaction involves at least 2 sets of beliefs, the patient's and the physician's. So what about the effect of the doctor's beliefs? Physicians can exert powerful effects through their beliefs. For instance, if they strongly favor a therapy, they can talk up its effects to the patient. In studies where patients do not know whether they're taking the active medication or a placebo pill, the doctor can unconsciously show more interest and enthusiasm in the treatment group than the control group. This can lead, through suggestion, to a heightened response on the part of the treatment group, all due to the doctor's belief that they should do better. Evidence also suggests that a physician's beliefs can alter the results of experiments in which he or she does not know which group is which. Consider the facts surrounding meprobamate, one of the earliest minor tranquilizing drugs marketed in the United States. During the 1950s, there were conflicting reports as to its effectiveness. Enthusiasts consistently found that it worked, while skeptics could find no effects beyond those of a placebo. To clarify this situation, researchers designed a double-blind study in which one of the physicians had a skeptical experimental attitude toward the drug, while the other had an enthusiastic therapeutic attitude toward it. They were totally unaware which pills were which, meprobamate or placebo. The patients did not know they were involved in an experiment. The results? Meprobamate proved significantly more powerful than the placebo, but only for the physician who believed in it. There was no drug effect for the skeptical physician's patients. This does not mean, of course, that drugs and other therapies cannot work on their own. If an individual is injected with 1,000 units of insulin, no matter who believes what, chances are that he or she will become unconscious as their blood sugar plummets. Double-blind tests aren't perfect, and their limitations ought to be acknowledged in medicine. The greatest value of double-blinds may lie in their limitations, which reveal something marvelous about us, that there's some aspect of the human psyche capable of shaping events in our world. 19th century French physician Armand Trousseau said, "One should use a new drug as often as possible while it still has the power to heal." Typically, new drugs are marketed with sensation, hype, and fanfare, whipping up enthusiasm among physicians. But when other factors begin to enter the picture, including the beliefs and the expectations of patient populations as well as the information about the drug's side effects, negative reports begin to circulate. The community of physician enthusiasts are thus converted toward a more skeptical stance. As beliefs about the medication swing toward the negative, the drug's effectiveness diminishes. The best possible situation is one in which both patient and doctor genuinely believe that a therapy is going to be effective. The worst is one in which there's a conflict between these beliefs, or one in which neither the physician nor the patient feels the therapy is going to work. In the latter case, two sets of negative beliefs are shaping the outcome of therapy, and this can set the stage for therapeutic disaster. Acknowledging the power of belief to shape outcomes in therapy ought to encourage doctors to critically examine their behavior toward patients. Many physicians cultivate an attitude of remoteness. Doctors usually defend these behaviors by claiming that one can do one's best only by remaining emotionally detached. It is also common for doctors to paint the very worst possible outcome. If things turn out better than predicted, the physician's a hero and the patient is grateful. This is known in the profession as hanging crepe, black crepe, as if at a funeral. This does not always involve deception. Many doctors are pessimists. The custom of giving the cold facts to patients following diagnosis is common. But patients who hear such comments as, "You have a 25% chance of surviving this cancer," frequently interpret such comments to mean, "I have a 75% chance of dying." If physicians' beliefs shape reality, then these doctor beliefs are capable independently of causing great harm. Thus, patients should carefully examine the beliefs of a doctor before affiliating with him or her. How do you do this? A simple but crucial question will suffice. Does my doctor make me feel better or worse when I'm around him or her? The importance of this issue was brought home to me in a letter I received from a woman with AIDS. Her doctor was a stern, no-nonsense fellow who believed in presenting a realistic picture to all of his patients. He would remind the woman on each visit that since AIDS is uniformly fatal, it was critical she follow her treatments to the letter. The doctor's beliefs had devastating effects. She said, "I began to realize my doctor doesn't believe I'm going to live. It takes me 2 weeks to recover from a visit to him. He leaves me depressed and feeling sick. Why do I feel that my own physician is killing me?" If the studies demonstrating the potency of a doctor's beliefs are valid, this doctor may actually be pushing his patient toward a negative outcome. But the situation is complex. Many physicians feel compelled to be totally factual with their patients, sometimes against their better judgment, because of the fear of legal recriminations. If they do not present a realistic picture, they can be sued for misleading a patient. Without some change in the legal climate, it is doubtful that most doctors will intentionally use belief therapeutically, even if they do honor its power to heal. The power of the physician's belief system to shape the patient's responses to therapy is akin to prayer. Both prayer and belief are non-local manifestations of consciousness because both can operate at a distance, sometimes outside the patient's awareness. Both affirm that it's not all physical, and both can be used adjunctively with other forms of therapy. How can a physician who is genuinely and honestly skeptical about a therapy use his or her beliefs positively for the good of the patient? Perhaps the first rule should be never to select a therapy one doesn't actually believe in. When this isn't possible, for instance, when a last-ditch therapy is chosen in a near-hopeless situation, the doctor should never obstruct the healing by being unnecessarily pessimistic. In addition, those physicians believing in prayer should actually consider employing it. If one is convinced that prayer works, not to use it is analogous to withholding a potent medication or surgical procedure. Because there may be no such thing as a perfect fit between the beliefs of a physician and a patient, two of the most valuable qualities a physician can cultivate are those of flexibility and tolerance. One of my most vivid lessons in flexibility began when I received an unexpected phone call one day from Ken, a close friend of mine. The legendary Native American shaman from Nevada, Rolling Thunder, was in Dallas to give a series of lectures on shamanic healing that Ken had helped arrange. All was not going well, however. Rolling Thunder was scheduled to give a major lecture that evening, but he had come down with a severe neck ache. I agreed to see him that afternoon, but was distinctly uncomfortable. Why would a powerful shaman who seemed to have nothing in common with the world of modern medicine want to visit an internist for a neck ache? Why should he not cure himself? Or why should he not see another shaman, someone who shared his beliefs about healing? Why go outside his own system? At the appointed hour, I looked down the hall and saw a nurse leading a colorful entourage of Native Americans all dressed in Western wear, including black hats and silver and turquoise belts. Rolling Thunder had come with his friends, and the group was quite impressive. We exchanged pleasantries, and I showed Rolling Thunder into an examining room. "Why did you decide to come to see me?" I asked. "I've got a bad pain in my neck." "Tell me about it." "Every time I give talks, they make me use a microphone. I stand up straight and I move my neck forward to speak into it. It puts a strain on my neck, and I always get this pain." He craned his neck forward to demonstrate the awkward position and showed me the area where he hurt. I could find nothing abnormal except for some hard, taut neck muscles that were in spasm. "Let's go into my office and chat," I said. Rolling Thunder followed me, and we sat down. All the while, I was asking myself the best way to deal with his immediate problem. Acting on a strong hunch, I asked, "Rolling Thunder, what do you think about the use of drugs? Why do you think I've come?" He went on to explain his personal philosophy of healing. There's a time for the shaman's chants, prayers, and herbs. There's also a place for a modern approach, he said, including the use of synthetic chemical medications. A wise healer uses what works. He doesn't confine himself to a single methodology. All things considered, Rolling Thunder believed the use of drugs was the best treatment for his neck ache in this particular situation. I went to the area where we kept sample medications and returned with two, a pain reliever and a muscle relaxant. I handed them to Rolling Thunder, and he beamed. "These will help me get through my talk tonight," he responded. The drugs worked. Rolling Thunder was in fine form at his lecture that night, speaking through the microphone he despised to a packed house. Negative prayer, sometimes called black prayer, is the flip side of prayer as we generally think of it. In black prayer, rather than asking the Absolute to intercede benevolently in human affairs, one invokes the powers to cause harm or wreak havoc. Followers of Western religions tend erroneously to believe that sorcery, hexing, and cursing are engaged in only by uncivilized peoples. But these activities permeate all religions and cultures. Many saintly curses would be right at home in the Bible, says John Carey, associate professor of Celtic languages and literature at Harvard. Elisha, for example, caused 42 children to be devoured by bears for making fun of his baldness in 2 Kings chapter 2, verses 23 and 24. Many healers who use prayer to help others will freely admit its potential for harm. Among them was the late Olga Worrell, the well-known psychic healer. Dr. Beverly Rubik, director of the Center for Frontier Sciences at Temple University, asked Worrell to interact with bacteria retarding their growth or actually killing them. Worrell strenuously objected. "I refuse to hurt them," she said. "I will only use my abilities for good." Honoring her wishes, Rubik modified the experiment. Researcher Bernard Grad performed landmark experiments on reputed psychic healers at Canada's McGill University. During the course of Grad's research, a man volunteered to be studied. He claimed he had the ability, using his hands, to cause an unusual reaction in certain living things such as fruit. He would hold a banana, for example, and focus on it in a specific way, whereupon it would blacken, shrink, and actually petrify. Grad retained one of the petrified bananas and had it mounted on a keychain, a miniature, rock-solid banana resembling marble. Many years ago, Zvi Bentwich, a famous researcher in the field of immunology, conducted tests on the famous psychic Uri Geller. In one particular experiment, Geller held his hands over a container of live sperm. His goal was to change the patterns of movement. When the treated sperm were promptly examined, the experimenters discovered that they were completely dead, while the controls were normal. The fluid in which the dead sperm were contained was collected and applied to the normal sperm. There was no effect, meaning that Geller had not surreptitiously applied a chemical that killed the sperm. Geller was reportedly very shaken by this unexpected glimpse into his capacity to cause harm. He had intended only to change the motility of the sperm, not kill them. These studies should give us pause. If people can retard or inhibit the growth of microorganisms, why should these negative influences not extend to humans? The history of hypnosis is richly peppered with evidence suggesting that it is possible for one person to affect the behavior of a distant individual without the receiver's awareness. Consider this anecdote from the late 1800s. One day, the famous physician and hypnotist Charles Richet was sitting in the dining room of Beaujon Hospital with his colleague Landuzzi. Richet declared that he could put one of his patients to sleep at a distance and compel her to come to the dining room. 10 minutes elapsed, however, and nobody came. Richet and Landuzzi considered the experiment a failure, until a few minutes later, when someone came into the dining room and announced that a sleeping patient was found roaming the corridors of the hospital, searching for Dr. Richet, whom she could not find. Because anthropologists study cultures in which distant hexing is said to abound, I felt they should know whether these events really happen or not. Professor Michael Harner, the noted anthropologist and authority on shamanism, spent years doing fieldwork studying the Jivaro Indians of the Amazon. In Jivaro culture, distant hexing is taken for granted, Harner says. Their rationale is simple. If the victim is unaware he's being hexed, he won't take measures to counteract the hex or take revenge on the shaman. As an added safety measure, the Jivaro shamans perform distant hexing in teams of 2 or 3. If the victim tries to get even, there's safety in numbers. Distant hexing is really a security measure. One problem with studying these phenomena in the laboratory is that if hexing worked, subjects might die. A professor who taught a course called Parapsychology of the Occult actually took this risk. One of his students claimed he had the ability to perform hex deaths. For his term paper, he wanted to demonstrate this talent. The professor agreed. But we couldn't have him try to kill just anyone. That wouldn't be fair or nice, the professor said. So we agreed he would attempt by hex death to kill me. The professor left a sealed envelope with the registrar, on which he wrote, "Open this upon my death if it occurs within the next year." Inside the envelope, a note instructed the registrar to give the student an A if the professor died. The student agreed that if the professor did not die, he would receive an F. The student flunked. In 1917, psychologist Max Freedom Long arrived in Hawaii and devoted intensive study to kahuna magic. He was fascinated in particular with ana ana, Hawaiian for the death prayer. He discovered that in the kahuna tradition of Polynesia, which spread to the Hawaiian Islands, the death prayer had a redeeming social value. he describes its function. The kahunas taught the people to live without hurting others. Those who willfully hurt others were considered worthy of death and were frequently punished with the death prayer. It was the means of developing in Polynesia the most friendly and considerate people in the entire world. All the early explorers marveled at this and mentioned it in their writings without exception. The kahunas realized, as we in the West would later acknowledge, that the unconscious mind is highly susceptible to suggestion, even if the suggestion is absurd and illogical. This susceptibility allowed the death influence to be implanted in the unconscious, causing the victim to die. The weak spot in the armor of the unconscious that allowed the insertion of the fatal influence was usually guilt. An individual who possessed a deep sense of guilt for some actual or imaginary sin could be attacked by a spirit bent on punishing or killing him. The unconscious, convinced of its unworthiness, would meekly accept the attack because of its conviction that it deserved to be punished. According to Bell's theorem in modern physics, once subatomic particles have been in contact, they always remain connected in some sense, even if separated to the opposite ends of the universe. Could humans be joined in much the same way as subatomic particles? And could this connectedness make possible negative prayer and distant hexing? Certainly Bell's theorem does not prove that these events occur, or even that they're possible. But if anthropologists were made more aware that the principle of non-locality is today a legitimate part of modern physics, our most accurate science, maybe this would encourage them to keep an open mind about these strange reports. In all the world, I know of no therapies that are totally free of side effects. Acupuncture needles have caused bloodstream infections, herbs have caused anaphylactic shock, harmless spinal manipulation, quadriplegia. So it may be with prayer. As a physician, I find it wise to ask of any therapy at the outset, what's the downside? What are the side effects? We can be enthusiastic about the positive effects of prayer, but we need not be Pollyannas. In the spring of 1992, I was invited to participate in a health conference in Israel. In Jerusalem, I especially wanted to visit the Kotel, the Wailing Wall, where Jews traditionally go to mourn the destruction of their temple. Standing quietly alongside the Hasidim, I noticed that the cracks between the gigantic stones were crowned with scraps of paper on which prayers had been written. Wanting to participate in this ancient ritual, I pulled a bit of paper from my pocket and stood poised, pen in hand, prepared to write my special prayer. But nothing would come. I could think of nothing that needed praying for. The only thing I could think of was, I want to know the truth. Finally, I folded my blank scrap of paper, inserted it in a cranny along with thousands of other written entreaties, and walked away. As I left, an image of a different kind of wall entered my mind, a vision of a time when science was just beginning. In the 16th century in Europe, as philosopher Jacob Needleman describes in his book, A Sense of the Cosmos, the church was the ultimate arbiter of reality. Science, although the word did not exist then, arose in opposition to this custom. In Needleman's graphic metaphor, early scientists went to the wall of truth, where they confronted the world alone and invited the universe to reveal itself through their primitive experiments. This image of the early scientists' wall of truth had particular meaning for me as I left the Wailing Wall. At the time, I was struggling with the question of whether it was desirable to study prayer scientifically. My experience at the Wailing Wall left me with the feeling not only that it could be studied scientifically, but that it should be. Not everyone agrees. More people than ever before believe the scientist's wall of truth should extend only so far. They believe that science debases and violates whatever it touches. It's not difficult to see where this belief comes from. Prominent scientists state routinely that nothing in nature is sacred. They confidently assure us that the world is drifting along purposelessly, that it's nothing more than inanimate matter in motion. Since no harm could be done to the inanimate, any method of investigation whatsoever is justified. Many people believe that the general heartlessness of science is directly responsible for many global problems, such as pollution and environmental degradation. When it comes to investigating prayer scientifically, these same folks react with horror at the prospect of something divine being debased by the hard hearts of scientists. To be sure, prayer does not need science to legitimize or justify it. Even so, I believe that if science can demonstrate the potency of prayer, people who pray are likely to feel validated in their beliefs as a result. Using science does not always require that we put nature on the rack. Instead, we can honor what is being investigated and approach it with respect. From this point of view, investigating prayer does not imply bringing God into the laboratory, but bringing the laboratory to God. In the end, whether or not prayer can be proved experimentally does not really depend on anyone's opinion on the matter. The question can only be settled by actually performing experiments to see whether or not there is an effect that comes through under laboratory conditions. Skeptics and cynics say there is no reason to study prayer because basically there's nothing to study. Any effects we observe are due only to suggestion, the famous placebo response. Is prayer a placebo? We can find at least 3 answers to this important question. 1. Prayer can indeed act as a placebo. A person who merely knows he or she is being prayed for can mobilize healing energies that can be awesomely potent. 2. Prayer can be intrinsically harmful. Suggestion is a two-edged sword. If the effects of suggestion in prayer are real, they can be positive or negative. And the third possibility, prayer can be intrinsically helpful. Evidence is abundant for the intrinsic positive effects of prayer not only in humans but in mice, chicks, enzymes, fungi, yeast, bacteria, and various kinds of cells. We cannot dismiss these outcomes as being due to suggestion or placebo effects, since these so-called lower forms of life don't think in any conventional sense and are presumably not susceptible to suggestion. Even in experiments involving human beings, it has been possible to use prayer without the subject's awareness. Thus, the scientific evidence suggests the effects of prayer are not due entirely to placebo effects. But, I would ask, even if they were, what would it matter? Suppose a cancer disappears, and it can be proved beyond doubt that its disappearance was due just to placebo effects and suggestion. The cure would be no less real. Yet from another perspective, it matters immensely whether or not prayer actually works in health problems. Scientific studies of spiritual healing are simply crucial because they can help us find answers to the great questions of life. What does the experimental evidence for prayer actually look like? Currently, one can find over 130 controlled experiments in this area, over half of which show statistically significant results. That means that in more than half of these studies, it appears that the effects of prayer are real and cannot be explained by chance. All of these studies are not perfect. There is some variability in quality, as the skeptics and the cynics delight in pointing out. But this ought to be expected. There is no specific area in science where one can find 130 studies that do not show some variability. Many of these studies are fanatically precise. A great many are done by investigators who are exceptionally skilled. In judging this area, one should proceed as in any other area of experimental science. One pays particular attention to the best studies. What do they show? One acknowledges in advance that all the studies in any area of science are not going to point to the same conclusion. So, on balance, one looks at the preponderance of evidence. In what general direction do these studies point? My own conclusion is that there is abundant evidence that, under controlled laboratory conditions, prayer simply works. Studies in this area are basically of 2 types. those which look at the effect of prayer on humans, and those which examine prayer's effects on non-humans, such as bacteria, fungi, or seeds. So let's look at some examples of both types. And let's look not only at excellent studies which are very precise, but also at studies which have some problems, to give a fair view of the work that exists in this field. In a prayer experiment at the University of Redlands, California in 1951, 45 volunteers aged 22 to 60 brought a variety of problems to the study. These included depression and exaggerated fears. Others belong to that 50 to 75% who seek medical treatment when there's nothing organically wrong. Patients were divided into 3 groups. Group 1 was the just plain psychology group. No mention of religion was made during their therapy. Group 2, the just plain prayer group, prayed for themselves every night before retiring. They were Christians who had immense confidence in prayer and who believed psychological counseling unnecessary. Group 3, the prayer therapy group, met weekly for a 2-hour prayer session. The 3 groups were given several psychological tests before and after the experiment by a skilled psychometrist not directly involved in the experiment. The results of these tests were made available to the counselors in the psychotherapy group, Group 1, who used them to guide patients through therapy. The prayer therapy group, Group 3, also made use of the test results. Each week, the members received a sealed envelope containing a slip of paper on which was written a detrimental aspect of his or her personality revealed in the tests. This allowed the person to focus on the negative trait and try to eliminate it with a specific prayer. 9 months later, the patients were all given the tests once again by an impartial psychologist. Group 1, the psychotherapy group, had a 65% improvement. Group 2, the self-prayer group, had no improvement. Group 3, the prayer therapy group, had a 72% improvement. The researchers were convinced that they had witnessed, quote, total healing, end quote, in several participants in Group 3, the prayer therapy group, of conditions including migraine headaches, stuttering, ulcers, and epilepsy. For them, the power of prayer, when combined with information to the subjects about the results of their psychological testing, was evident. Even if the estimates of improvement are accurate, the prayer therapy Group 3 did only 7% better than the prayerless Group 1, which seems a very meager achievement. In addition, at least 3 factors were at work: prayer, group therapy, and individual feedback. It's not possible to separate the effects of these variables. Any of these factors could have made all the difference, part of the difference, or no difference at all. We simply do not know. Questions arise. Why would God answer prayers only for Group 3? Why didn't Group 2, who were Christians praying for themselves in privacy, improve? The explanation of the researchers was that since they asked and received not, they must have somehow unknowingly asked amiss. Well, this is unconvincing because it ignores the fact that the prayerless Group 1 patients also received and didn't even ask. Skeptics of prayer generally state that any proof that prayer is effective is due only to poorly designed experiments and is therefore an illusion. If the experiments are airtight, the effect will be eliminated. A study frequently cited by skeptics to prove these contentions is a prayer experiment performed on children with leukemia that was reported in 1965. A researcher randomly assigned 10 of 18 leukemic children for treatment by a prayer group at a church. All 18 children continued their routine medical treatments. Neither the children nor their treating physicians knew they were subjects of an experiment in prayer. The results of this study were inconclusive, with no significant differences between the groups. Skeptics of prayer seem generally elated about this outcome and seldom fail to cite this study as proof against the effectiveness of prayer. But as Dr. Daniel J. Benor has observed, there are so many flaws in this study, it's an embarrassment to anyone with research experience. Some of the reasons this study was doomed from the start are as follows. There were too few patients on which to base any conclusions. Also, no assessment was given about the comparability of the two groups. That is, one can't tell if one group was sicker than the other. Also, the patients did not even have the same illness. 2 patients in the unprayed-for group had myelogenous leukemia, whereas all other patients in both groups had lymphatic leukemia. This fact is crucial because some forms of leukemia have a worse prognosis than others. Also, no information is given as to other important variables like age and sex. Also, criteria for improvement in this study are not specified. Moreover, no checks were made to see whether families committed to prayer actually kept their obligation, and if so, how often they prayed. Furthermore, neither can we tell anything about the variability of chemotherapy treatment in these children. Like the Redlands experiment, this study's poor design renders its findings inconclusive. Nobel neurophysiologist Sir John Eccles has proposed that the human brain is exquisitely sensitive to thought. Might the brain's sensitivity to thought make it more likely to respond to the mental efforts of other persons, such as healers? Certain blood cells have a lot in common with brain tissue. For example, many white blood cells contain identical receptor sites for neurotransmitter molecules that exist also in the brain. So, if mind cognitively caresses brain tissue, might it similarly affect blood cells that are functionally similar? Dr. William G. Broad of the Mind Science Foundation in San Antonio, Texas, put this question to the test. He wanted to know whether ordinary people could mentally protect red blood cells from serious stressful influences, whether this could be done at a distance, and whether this effect is selfish, that is, if the mentally protective effect works better on a subject's own red blood cells than on those of others. In Broad's experiment, 32 subjects mentally attempted to keep red blood cells, RBCs, from dissolving when they were placed in a dilute solution. Approximately half of Broad's subjects were instructed to try mentally to protect their own blood cells, while half were assigned to protect blood cells of another person. The subjects did not know if the blood came from their own body or from someone else. Dr. Broad reached 2 important conclusions. First, the subjects could influence the rate of hemolysis of the distant red blood cells to a degree unexplainable by chance. Second, the source of the blood was not significant in the group as a whole. However, when individual performances were examined, the 5 most skillful subjects in the entire experiment were those trying to influence their own blood. Broad suggests that the mental strategies each individual employs may be important. In his study, some people used images in which the red blood cells were visualized in a very realistic manner. Others used mental images involving objects similar but not identical to red blood cells. Broad also suggests that personality differences among subjects may affect the results. Cardiologist Randolph Bird designed a scientific evaluation of the role of God in healing. Over a 10-month period, a computer assigned 393 patients admitted to the coronary care unit at San Francisco General Hospital to either a group that was prayed for by home prayer groups or to a group not remembered in prayer. Neither the patients, nurses, nor the doctors knew which group the patients were in. The prayer groups were given the first names of their patients, as well as a brief description of their diagnosis and condition. They were asked to pray each day, but were given no specific instructions on how to pray. The prayed-for patients differed in several areas. They were 5 times less likely than the unremembered group to require antibiotics. They were 3 times less likely to develop pulmonary edema, a condition in which the lungs fill with fluid. None of the prayed-for group required endotracheal intubation, in which an artificial airway is inserted in the throat, while 12 in the unremembered group required mechanical ventilatory support. Fewer patients in the prayed-for group died. When the results of Dr. Bird's study were announced, they created a sensation. News of this experiment was carried on every major wire service in the United States. Believers felt that at long last, a careful study had finally demonstrated a profound effect of prayer, and the skeptics would finally be silenced. This was not to be. Some of the criticisms are as follows. For one thing, the study recruited only born-again Christians to pray. Also, the praying people were instructed to pray daily for a rapid recovery and for prevention of complications and death. Yet there were no safeguards to determine if the prayer groups really prayed or not. The praying people were told only to pray, not how to pray, and were not asked about the specific methods they employed. Providing the intercessors with the first names of the patients creates a potentially interesting problem. Presumably, there were several people with the same first names in these 393 patients. And what if there were Johns and Marys in both the control and prayer groups? If the intercessor prayed for John or for Mary, which John or Mary would receive the prayer? We also know nothing about the skills of the various physicians caring for these patients. Some doctors are more prone to use medications than others. Some keep their patients in the coronary care unit longer than others. If doctors less inclined to use antibiotics cared predominantly for patients in the prayer group, the lower incidence of use of these drugs might have reflected not the use of prayer, but the conservative prescribing habits of these physicians. Also, there was no attempt to assess the psychological coping mechanisms of the patients. We know that the most effective psychological coping strategy during the first 24 hours following a heart attack is denial. If there were more deniers in the prayed-for group, this factor might have accounted for the improvements. Furthermore, we do not know whether or how much the patients in the control group prayed for themselves, or whether their relatives prayed for them. For all we know, the control group may have been prayed for more than the formal prayer group. The most impressive difference was the need for intubation and mechanical ventilation. None of the prayed-for patients required such. Except for that one category of clinical response, the prayed-for patients achieved only a 5 to 7% improvement over the controls. If prayer works, why these minimal differences? The Bird experiment simply contains too many problems that prevent us from drawing firm conclusions about the possible power of prayer. In fact, all the human prayer studies we've examined so far fall into this category. When it comes to proof of the power of prayer, we want more than a 7% advantage. We want more than a mere suggestion that prayer works. So in view of this, many researchers feel it's easier to study the effects of prayer in simple, non-human living systems. Prayer experiments in simpler life forms are much less ambiguous, they involve fewer variables, and they're a lot easier to interpret. A number of studies have researched the effects of healing on fungi, yeast, or bacteria. These experiments have implications for health and illness. Among them are these: the ability to inhibit or increase the growth of bacteria, the influence on genetic mutations by the conscious efforts of others, therefore suggesting that the genes cannot be the absolute controllers they are represented to be. These studies showed that the effects of spiritual healing can be completely independent of the psychology of the subject. We can assume the microorganisms did not know they were subjects in an experiment. Also, healing operated as powerfully at a distance as it did nearby in these experiments. Ordinary people were able to bring about biological changes in living organisms. This suggests that everyone may possess healing abilities, at least to some degree. Negative effects, such as inhibition of growth, as well as positive effects, such as promotion of growth, were observed in these studies. In an oft-quoted classic study, Dr. Bernard Grad of Canada's McGill University studied Oscar Estebane's ability to heal artificially created surgical wounds in 48 mice. Estebane held the cages of the experimental group 15 minutes twice daily for 14 days. The mice healed significantly faster than wounded mice whose cages were not held. In a similar experiment, Where healers attempted to revive a group of anesthetized mice more quickly than a control group, experimenters found a peculiar linger effect. If one side of a table was used by the healers, and if the healers were then dismissed and more anesthetized rats were placed immediately on that side of the table, they recovered faster than controls placed on the table's other side. What's the relation between transpersonal imagery and prayer? Both prayer and imagery have in common the ability to bring about helpful changes in the bodies of others at a distance without the subject's conscious awareness. We don't know how the mind of one person can engage in action at a distance to bring about healthful changes in someone else. Yet healers frequently say that healing energy is sent. Perhaps the only conventional energy that may qualify as a potential mediator for distant healing is extremely low-frequency electromagnetic radiation. ELF has excellent penetrating properties and little attenuation with distance. Yet ELF fields would have to behave in highly unusual ways with respect to time in order to explain the time-displaced mental effects that have been observed in certain experiments. The truth is, we do not know how spiritual healing works. Many skeptics argue that this is sufficient reason for tossing it out the window. Yet no one knew how penicillin worked when Fleming made his famous observation that bacterial growth was inhibited by fungi. If the scientific community had used ignorance of the process as a justification for rejecting his discovery, the introduction of life-saving antibiotics would have been delayed. History shows that full explanations frequently come later. So it may be with prayer and spiritual healing. Dr. Daniel Benor suggests various reasons why scientists and skeptics reject scientific evidence for distant healing. Among them are these. 1. Western materialistic beliefs exclude the possibility of prayer-based healing. Modern medical science has become synonymous with reliance on drugs, surgery, radiation, and so on. The possibility that non-material forms of healing might exist is virtually unthinkable. 2. It is human nature to resist change. 3. Cognitive dissonance, meaning a conflict between a person's perception and a person's belief system, may cause the healing event to be rejected without proper attention to evidence. 4. Spiritual healing is often equated with mysticism, and many intellectually oriented people fear getting lost in the inner void of the mystic. 5. Prayer-type healing may occur outside of conscious control. This can be very unsettling to someone who may inherently fear the workings of the unconscious. 6. The power of others may be feared. 7. One's own healing powers may be feared. 8. Healing power is believed to be possessed only by people who are strange or different. 9. There exists a lack of replicability in healing phenomena. Researchers have not yet isolated the critical variables which can explain, much less predict, when healing will or won't happen. 10. Healing has laws that appear to differ from those of other sciences. The length of time required to heal varies drastically between patients, but healers can't say why. 11. Healing is often allied with specific religions that emphasize faith and belief. Emphasizing the role of faith and belief in healing appears to be a step back in history for most scientists. 12. Importantly, careers and financial investments are at stake here. Almost all research grants, professorships, and health products are aligned currently with the physically based view of reality. Jiddu Krishnamurti, one of the most revered spiritual teachers of this century, once asked a small group of listeners what they would say to a close friend who was about to die. Their answers dealt with assurances, words about beginnings and endings, and various gestures of compassion. Krishnamurti stopped them short. "There's only one thing you can say to give the deepest comfort," he said. "Tell him that in his death, a part of you dies and goes with him. Wherever he goes, you go also. He will not be alone." Prayer is like that. It's our tie to the absolute. It's the universe's affirmation that we are immortal and eternal, and that we're not alone. We do not know why prayer reveals itself in scientific experiments, but we have seen that it does. And what if it didn't? Would it be less real? In spite of its reputation as the most powerful arbiter of reality, nowhere is it written down that science is the only gateway to what is real. We invented the scientific method. It did not descend from on high. Although science has a lot to say about prayer, it really raises more questions than it answers. Why, we may lament, is the effect of prayer not more dependable? We need to recall that prayer, in its function as a bridge to the absolute, has no failure rate. It works 100% of the time, unless we prevent this realization by remaining oblivious to it. We may wonder why prayer is so paradoxical and unpredictable, but the astonishing fact is that it works at all, and not only in laboratory experiments, but in the most glorious and benevolent way imaginable, as a reminder of our origin and our destiny, the absolute, the universal, the divine.